As we journey through time, we are constantly searching for meaning and purpose in the world around us. Our ancestors were no different, and they looked to the natural world for guidance and for inspiration. In ancient Europe, these seekers of wisdom created sacred places where they could connect with the divine, seek answers, and understand life's mysteries, as well as celebrate the cycles of nature. From the awesome towering oak groves of the barbarian tribes to the marvelous temples of the Mediterranean civilizations, these sacred spaces were imbued with a profound sense of mystery and magic that continues to captivate us to this day. In this video, we will delve into the hidden world of our European ancestors and explore the sacred spaces they created. We will discover the deep symbolism and rich cosmology that these spaces held, and learn how our ancestors used them to connect with the divine. Join me on this journey through time and space as we uncover the secrets of the sacred spaces of our European ancestors. You never know what mysteries await you in these hidden realms, so hold on tight and prepare to be transported to a magic world full of myth and legend. But before we continue, I would like to once more mention that I have recently published an article on the unitedhomesteads.com, where if you go through the link in the description and if you use the provided code, you will have a 10% discount. The United Homesteads is a wonderful place where you can learn various skills and ways of maintaining your homestead, as well as connect with other like-minded people in your area. The topics you will find are very rich and various, ranging from folklore, for which I write most of the time, all the way to bushcraft and blacksmithing, and all of which are presented in a very unique way and will aid you in your goal to becoming more self-sustainable. So if you're interested in learning something new, feel free to subscribe using the link and the code in the description below. Man regards certain spaces as sacred due to his innate sense of the divine and the numinous. This sense of the divine is unique to human beings, as it allows them to recognize the presence of something greater than themselves in the world. In addition, humans have the ability to conceptualize and to symbolize the sacred, which allows them to create spaces and rituals that help them to cultivate their connections to the divine. This ability to create sacred spaces and engage in rituals is what distinguishes humans from animals. Animals do not have the same capacity for abstract thought and symbolic communication, and therefore do not have a concept of the sacred or the divine. While they may have instincts and certain patterns of behavior that are important for their survival, these instincts do not translate into a sense of the sacred or a connection to the divine. A sacred space is a physical or conceptual space that is considered sacred or holy by a particular culture, religion, or individual. It is a space that is set apart from the mundane world, imbued with a special significance or spiritual energy, and used for religious or spiritual purposes such as worship, prayer, ritual, or meditation. Sacred spaces can take many forms, such as natural landscapes, temples, shrines, altars, or even personal spaces such as one's own household. Some of the earliest sacred spaces were natural formations such as caves, rocks, mountains, as well as ancient trees. These places were considered sacred and imbued with spiritual power due to their awe-inspiring size and beauty, and were often used for ritual purposes such as burials, offerings, and initiation ceremonies. As human societies became more complex, sacred spaces also began to be created by humans through the construction of temples, shrines, burial mounds, and other religious structures. But the size and beauty wasn't the only reason for which these places were sacralized. The idea of a sacred space is often tied to the belief that certain places or spaces have a special power or ability to facilitate communication with the gods or ancestors and promote spiritual growth and transformation. Because of this, the ancient concept of the sacred space was centered on the idea of encompassing all elements of the cosmos, including the sky, earth, and underworld, either through physical presence or symbolic representations. In other words, the sacred space was an embodiment of the totality of the cosmos. This is why natural sites were among the earliest sacred spaces, often with a sacred tree nearby. The tree, which appears in all European mythologies and beyond, represents the axis mundi, that is to say, the cosmic axis, as it reaches towards the sky with its branches and connects to the underworld with its roots, unifying the opposing realms. A sacred body of water, such as a spring, lake, river, or well, was also present under the tree, symbolizing the chthonic realm and the source of all life. As time passed and human civilization developed, the construction of temples became more prevalent. These structures were not only places of worship but also served as a physical representation of the cosmos and the harmony within it. This was achieved through the inclusion of cosmological symbolism within their architectural designs, further emphasizing the significance of sacred spaces and their connection to the larger universe. Nevertheless, although the sacred space was now represented by the temple, sacred trees almost always grew nearby and continue to do so near many churches today. The temple was therefore not just a gathering and cult place, but a place where one had the experience of the cosmos in a structure often identified with man's body, which was seen as a microcosmic image of the macrocosm. Many European peoples began building temples in a later period of their history, or did not build them at all and venerated their gods in the natural sacred spaces until they were converted to Christianity. The architecture of ancient temples often reflected their cosmology and religious beliefs. For example, the design of Greco-Roman temples was highly symbolic, with different architectural features representing different aspects of their mythology and beliefs. The use of symmetry, proportions, and geometric patterns in Greco-Roman temple design also reflected their belief in the harmony and balance of the universe. These elements were used to create a sense of order and balance in the temple's design, which was seen as a reflection of the divine order of the universe. The temple's columns were designed to create the illusion of upward movement, representing the ascent from the earthly realm to the realm of the gods. The roof itself was often designed to represent the sky or the heavens, and was sometimes painted blue or decorated with stars to create the illusion of a celestial dome. This reflected the belief that the temple was a gateway to the divine realm, and that the roof symbolically connected the earthly realm of mortals with the divine realm of the gods. The shape of the roof also had symbolic significance. For example, the roof, which consists of two sloping sides that meet at a ridge or peak, was a common feature in ancient Greek temple design. The roof was said to represent the arms of the gods reaching down to embrace the temple, and was seen as a symbol of divine protection. In Roman temple design, the roof was often flatter and more horizontal, reflecting the influence of Etruscan and other architectural styles, but it nevertheless continued to represent the sky. When it comes to symbolic images which represented the cosmos, there are two basic shapes which are the most important and from which many symbols developed: the circle and the square, or its variation, the rhombus. The circle and the square, or the rhombus, were the two of the most important geometric shapes among all European people. The circle represented the sky or the universe as a whole and was seen as a perfect and complete shape, often used to symbolize the order and harmony of the universe. It also represented the cycles of nature, the seasons, and the movements of the heavenly bodies. In temple design, circular elements were often used to represent the dome of the sky or the celestial realm. And this is still the case for many churches in Europe today who inherited these symbolic architectural elements. The square, on the other hand, represented the earth and was often used in temple design to represent the solid and stable foundation of the universe. The square was seen as a symbol of balance and stability and was often used in the design of temple floors and other architectural features. However, the older and deeper meaning of the square and the rhombus is related to the body and the womb of the earth goddess, as well as the sacred space. I have written about these symbols in great detail in my book Slavic Traditions and Mythology for those who are interested in learning more. They can be found all over Europe throughout the centuries, painted or engraved on objects, embroidered on folk costumes, and so forth. In temple design, these elements were mostly used by the ancient Greeks and Romans and are still used in Christian churches and Hindu temples today. The center of the square, rhombus, circle, or any symbol or building that combines these elements was always considered to represent the cosmic axis or the center of the universe. We have an excellent example from ancient Greek mythology of how the Temple of Delphi was built exactly at the center of the world. According to the myth, Zeus, the king of the gods, had two eagles that he sent to fly in opposite directions from the two ends of the earth. These eagles met and fought at the center of the world, which is why the temple was built there. The name Delphi is derived from the ancient Greek word Delphus or Delphos, meaning womb, while the stone artifact which marks the center of the temple and the world is called omphalos, which means navel. The exact same concept can be found in Hindu temples, where the temple is the representation of the divine body under human form. The body of the deity is inscribed in the square bases of the temple, with the center of the temple corresponding to the navel of the divinity. The architectural element at the center of the temple, which is the shrine and the most sacred space of the temple, is called Garbhagriha or womb chamber, and it houses the murti, which is a sacred icon or statue of the deity. This concept is actually not Indo-European, for we can trace its origin in Europe since the Mesolithic culture of Lepenski Vir, located today in Serbia on the border with Romania. What is very important about this culture is that we find the oldest houses with a fireplace in Europe alongside the coast of the Danube River. However, these houses were more than just shelters. They were also sanctuaries for the ancestral cult of the people who buried their dead or parts of their dead under the threshold, under the floor, and especially under the fireplace of the house. The house, the cosmos, had the altar standing at its center, just above the fireplace, under which the ancestors were buried. When we compare the position of one of the skeletons and the geometry of the house, we can see that the altar, the cosmic center, corresponds perfectly to the navel of the ancestor. The navel of the world is therefore the navel of the ancestor and corresponds perfectly to the Hindu understanding that the center of the temple is the navel of the deity. This is why across all of Europe, the hearth was usually at the center of the house and why it was inseparable from the cult of the ancestors. The house itself was sacred and was considered a sacred space, a microcosmic image of the universe, and a temple to the household deities, which I have written about extensively in my book Slavic Traditions and Mythology. In the Slavic tradition, the central pillar of the house was also an object of veneration. It was often a substitute for an idol and called grandfather, who was also regarded as the cosmic axis. The center of the sacred space, regardless if it was an outdoor shrine, house, or a temple, was always the most sacred place among all European people, and it contained a hearth, an image or idol of a deity, an altar, or a combination of these elements. In ancient Greek religion, for example, the focus was often on the cult statue of the deity, which was also housed in a central chamber of the temple. Similarly, in the Roman religion, temples typically housed the cult statue of the deity. However, some Roman temples, such as the Temple of Vesta, did have a central hearth or a fireplace, which was tended by the Vestal Virgins. In the Celtic religion, there is evidence that some shrines had a central hearth or a fireplace, which was used for ritual purposes. For the Germanic tradition, for example, Tacitus tells us that the Germanic tribes did not build temples or make idols, but worshipped them in natural places. Later on, we have Norse sources which speak of temples, called hofs, dedicated to the gods, in which we can observe the same situation. In one saga, for example, there is a description of Thorgrim's Hagalson's temple, saying that the image of Thor stood in the center of the hof, with other gods on both sides. In front of them was an altar made with great skill and covered with iron on the top. On this, there was to be fire which would never go out. They called it the sacred fire. On the altar was to lie a sacred great armband made of silver. A great copper bowl was to stand on the altar, and into it was to go the blood which came from animals or men given to Thor. The most famous hidden hof of the Viking Age is that at Uppsala in Sweden, which was described by Adam of Bremen, and at whose center we can again see the idol of Thor. He says, "In this temple, entirely decked out in gold, the people worship 3 statues of 3 gods, in such wise that the mightiest of them, Thor, occupies a throne in the middle of the chamber. Wotan and Frigga have places on either side." Archaeological findings and historical sources constantly indicate that Slavic pagan temples were constructed between the 9th and 12th centuries. One noteworthy example is the temple dedicated to the god Sventovit, situated on Cape Arkona on the island of Rügen in Germany. The temple was positioned at the tip of the cape, surrounded by water on 3 sides, indicating that it was built in accordance with the cosmological geomorphology of the area. The idol was located at the center of the temple, and the cape's peak, which resembled a cosmic mountain rising from above the waters, represented by the sea, added to the symbolism. The Temple of Triglav is another instance of this cosmological order, situated at the highest of 3 hills that corresponded to the peak of the mythical cosmic mountain, further emphasizing the idea of a cosmic center. Another good example is recorded by Helmold when he speaks about the god Prove or Prone, often considered a distorted name of Perun. According to him, this deity was not represented by an idol, but by a sacred oak tree surrounded by a fence which marked the sacred space. The Slavic people also constructed open-air kapishta, which were most of the times circular structures without walls or roofs. where a central wooden or stone idol, a fireplace, and sacrificial altars were placed. Sacrifices were commonly burnt in the fire, and the altars featured a vessel such as a horn or a bowl intended for the collection of the blood of the sacrificed animals and the pouring of libations. The kapishta could be enclosed by a ditch, a wooden fence or dug out soil, or by several deep holes with fires often lit in them, and the remains of the sacrifices were discovered in a few. The circular design of the shrine represents the cosmos and the sacred space, with the idol positioned at its axis. Only the priests or initiates were likely granted access to perform rituals inside. Symbolically, crossing the small bridge to enter the shrine represented a journey from the mundane world to the other world, where one could return from, transformed, enlightened, and reborn. The idea of creating a sacred place with boundaries and a central focus for worship is not at all unique to the Slavic people, but was a widespread practice among the ancient European peoples, and variation of this concept can be found in many different cultures throughout history. It was common, for example, that Slavic, Baltic, and Germanic sacred places around temples to be marked by fencing. In the ancient Greek religion, the sacred enclosure that was reserved for a specific deity or group of deities was called temenos. The word temenos means land marked off. Within the temenos, there would often be a temple or other religious structure that housed the cult statue of the deity, as well as other features such as altars and votive offerings. The temenos could be a walled or fenced area, a grove of trees, or even an entire city. The temenos was considered a sacred space and was believed to be under the protection of the deity or deities associated with it. The shape of the temenos in ancient Greece could vary depending on the location and the deity associated with it. Some temenoi were square or rectangular, while others were circular or irregular in shape. The marking of its boundaries was often accompanied by ritual and ceremony. The process of marking out the boundaries, known as peribolos, was typically performed by priests, often in the presence of the local community. The peribolos ceremony involved using a plow or other tool to dig a furrow around the perimeter of the area designated as the temenos. The furrow would then be filled with offerings such as honey, wine, and other foods to symbolize the sanctity of the space and the presence of the deity. In some cases, the peribolos ceremony would also involve the sacrifice of an animal to further emphasize the sacred nature of the space and to ensure the protection and favor of the deity associated with the temenos. Once the peribolos was completed, the temenos was considered to be sacred. It was a sacred space under the protection of the associated deity or several deities, and it was reserved for religious activities such as offerings, sacrifices, and other rituals. The center of the temenos was naturally the location of the altar or cult statue of the deity or deities associated with the sacred space. As such, the center of the temenos was typically the focus of religious activity and ritual, and there were a variety of rituals that could be performed at the center depending on the specific cult and religious practices associated with the deity in question. For example, at the previously mentioned temple of Apollo at Delphi, the center of the temenos was the location of the sacred omphalos stone, which, as we saw, was regarded as the cosmic axis. This concept of sacred enclosure was among the Romans called templum. Some Baltic tribes called it romuva, while the Celts called it nemeton. The templum is the Latin term for the sacred space, which was typically a rectangular area marked out by the augurs, who were priests responsible for the interpretation of the will of the gods. The templum was considered to be the designated place for the performance of public religious rituals and ceremonies. The creation of a templum involved a complex process of divination, which was carried out by these priests. The priests used a variety of techniques to determine the auspicious location and boundaries of this sacred space. They would observe the flight of birds, their patterns, examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, and study the movements of the clouds to determine the will of the gods. Once the boundaries of the templum were determined, the priests would use a variety of implements, such as a plow or a cord, to physically mark out the boundaries of the sacred space. The templum would often include an altar, which was used for the offering of sacrifices and other religious rites. The templum was not the same as the temple in a modern sense, although it could contain a temple or several temples dedicated to specific gods. It was a larger area that included the temple or temples, as well as a space of worship, ritual, and other activities. We observe a similar structure in the Italic ritual of plowing a quadrilateral shape with a central mouth in which all the good fruits were offered. Such similar rituals can be found all over Europe, and they are in relation to the Vedic ritual of marking the space of the sacrificial fire. This central mouth in which they sacrificed the first fruits was among the Romans called mundus, located at the center of the plowed boundaries of Rome. The mundus was a circular pit or opening in the ground that was seen as a gateway between the world of the living and the world of the dead. During the foundation of Rome, in the central mundus of the plowed borders of the city, which according to some had a quadrilateral shape, the people sacrificed the first fruits of everything which was considered good and valuable as well. The mundus was opened several times a year during important religious festivals, such as the Parentalia, which was a festival in honor of the ancestors, and the Vulcanalia, which was a festival in honor of the god Vulcan. During these festivals, offerings were made to the gods and to the spirits of the dead, and the mundus was seen as a portal through which these offerings could be delivered. The Celts, as we said, also knew of such a sacred enclosure, which was called nemeton, often located in natural places such as groves, forests, or hilltops. Though nemeta were often located in natural settings and frequently featured trees, some scholars believe that the term referred to a wider range of ritual spaces, including shrines and temples. Evidence of nemeta can be found throughout the Celtic world in the form of place names and inscriptions. These toponyms span a vast geographic range, stretching from the west of the Iberian Peninsula to Scotland in the north and central Turkey in the east. They were places of worship and ritual for the ancient Celts and were often dedicated to specific gods or goddesses. It was there that the priests and druids would conduct religious ceremonies, including sacrifices, divinations, and other forms of worship. The trees within the nemeton were sacred, believed to have spiritual powers, and often accompanied by a spring or a well. The nemeta were primarily natural spaces. They were not typically made in the same way that one makes a temple or other structure. Rather, they were often found in pre-existing natural settings such as groves, forests, or hilltops. The sacred nature of these spaces was often recognized and enhanced through the use of symbols and rituals. In some cases, it is possible that nemeta were marked or delineated using physical boundaries such as stones, posts, fences, or other markers. However, the exact nature of these boundaries is not always clear and may have varied depending on the specific nematon and the cultural context in which it was situated. Ultimately, the creation and maintenance of the nemata was likely a collaborative effort between human communities and the natural environment. By recognizing and respecting the sacred nature of these spaces, ancient peoples sought to establish a connection between themselves and the wider universe, and to access the spiritual power and wisdom that they believed resided in these places. As we conclude this journey through the mysterious and profound world of our European ancestors' sacred places, it is clear that these spaces were much more than just physical locations. They were gateways to the other world and embodiments of natural principles which reveal a worldview that was deeply symbolic and cosmological. Our ancestors expressed this wisdom in their sacred spaces since times immemorial. However, much more can be said about these sacred spaces and the hidden relationships between caves, burial mounds, houses, temples, and other representations of the sacred space. If you are intrigued by this topic, I encourage you to read my book Slavic Traditions and Mythology and check out my other books as well for a deeper understanding of the worldview and tradition of our ancestors. As we continue to explore and uncover the mysteries of our past, we may find that these ancient practices and beliefs have much more to teach us than we could ever imagine. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.